Today I'd like to talk to you about trying to implement an effective strength and conditioning program. First off, I'm going to start with a little bit of the history. This is much more of a logical history progression as opposed to actually done by research. Hopefully it'll bring a little bit of a different perspective to sports and coaching in general. Basically, games have always existed in human history. We've always had competition. Even during the worst of times, we've always wanted to play games. Because we have games and because we put so much of an emphasis on games and competition, people always strive to do better. And that occurred pretty much as soon as games started. Because of that, eventually people specialized in getting good at preparing other people so that they could perform even better for themselves. So that's kind of the history of coaching there. When it transformed into strength and conditioning coaching, that's kind of a phenomenon that's happened much more with the emphasis on specialization in sports in Western civilization. Because of that, coaches had to get better, and they had to become better at their own sports, and so they started to neglect some of the basics, some of the components of teaching athletes to be athletes. Because of that, new coaching field developed, strength and conditioning, which coached kids to be athletes before they were coached to do any sport, no matter what it was. So basically, for my research, I read a book by Gentry and Casario. Those are the strength and conditioning coaches at Furman and at Virginia Tech. And one of the big ideas of strength and conditioning is this pyramid of strength and conditioning. So I'll talk here about the science briefly and then talk a little bit more about motivation and how to implement it. Basically, the bottom is strength and endurance. No matter what you're doing, you have to have the strength and endurance required to do that specific task. And the more strength and endurance you have, the better you can perform that task. From there, you go up a level to power. That's how quickly or how much of that strength and endurance you can put into a particular movement in a given period of time. So a bench press kind of measures your strength, right? Because you can sit there no matter how long and you just have to get your elbows locked out. But now a blocking move in football, you only have a split second in which you're in contact with the opposing player to transfer all of your energy to them, to keep them from getting to the quarterback. That's kind of how the power comes into play. Speed is how quickly you can move, so that's the next level, and agility is being able to move yourself in completely changing direction, right? Agility, at the top, really at the very top pinnacle of it is sport. So that's agility, speed, power, and strength and endurance, all in an environment that constantly changes, adapting to that environment. So one of the huge concepts of strength conditioning is specificity. Whenever a strength conditioning gets an assignment, he or she must do a skills analysis. What are the common injuries? Greenlaw is one of the strength conditioning coaches over at App State that I was lucky enough to interview, and he talks about how a strength and conditioning coach should know what the sport requires and what common injuries there are so that they can build muscle to prevent those injuries. Obviously, building that strength and endurance base is going to be one of the key components of that. There's also the SAID principle, and that stands for specific adaptations to imposed demands. This means that if I am a football player coming back from summer and training my 1 mile run during preseason, as a lot of coaches end up asking players to do, isn't really going to help me very much because in football I'm never really going to be running a mile. Now, if cross-country runner, that's a completely different story. That would be applicable, and I wouldn't want to be doing the wind sprints that a lot of basketball players do. Also, there's the concept of muscle fiber development. Muscle fibers either produce a lot of power in a short amount of time with very little endurance, or they produce a lot of endurance, right? They can produce a lot of energy over a long period of time, but the amount of energy they produce at any given point in time is not very high. And there's a range all the way between them. Obviously, the power lifter is going to be training one type of muscle fibers, and the cross-country runner is going to be training the other. Another great concept is periodization. This is basically the idea that a year is going to be split up many different ways. Most coaches do the off-season, a preseason, a championship season. The idea is the off season is the time immediately following a competition season where the quote-unquote gym gains can be made. It's going to increase strength, endurance, and power. And then you're going to move on to the preseason, which is going to be usually the couple months that the coach has to work with his or her team to develop their team into the team that they want to take into the competition season. And there as a strength conditioning coach, you want to be developing speed and agility. Finally, you'll get to the championship season. And Greenland talks about how kids have a moneymaker. A great baseball player who can hit a ball really far, obviously he doesn't get any points on the field or a large contract because he can bench a whole ton of weight. He gets the contract because he can put that ball over the fence, right? The application of your athleticism to your sport is what you're going to concentrate on in the championship season, and that even as a strength and conditioning coach. So trying to do sport-specific drills and help your players recover is a lot more of the idea during season for a strength and conditioning coach. So now I'm going to shift and talk to you a little bit about motivation. Motivation is the holy grail, and we're questing for the holy grail. Hopefully you get the references from the pictures up here. But the idea is that I may have the best strength and conditioning program out there, but if people don't buy into that strength and conditioning program, it's not really going to do a whole much. I could also have a very mediocre program, but if people buy in and do that program to the best of their abilities, my results are really going to end up pretty good. So motivation is what's going to make or break a strength and conditioning coach. So to talk a little about motivation, there's a couple of theories. The first one is the achievement goal theory, and that's basically what people receive benefit from, how people interpret value. There's two kinds of people: task-oriented people and ego-oriented people. Task-oriented people you can kind of think of as people who do their best, they do the task their best of their ability, and they're satisfied that they did that task to the best of their ability. Ego-oriented people, on the other hand, they're not of the same mentality. They're trying to be better than the peers around them. Because of this, they're just kind of one little step better than the person behind them in the depth chart. They're not really the best that they can be. They're just they do enough to be enough. Because of this, we want to make sure that as a strength and conditioning coach, effort counts for something. And this also applies to coaching in general. Rewarding those who are putting their all into the weight session or the practice session should be rewarded in some way. Also, you can tell who the task-oriented and the ego-oriented people by their body language. When the game is not going very well, a task-oriented person, sure, they may be upset, but they're going to sit there and they're going to think about how they can make their performance better, how they can perform to the best of their ability. On the other hand, an ego-oriented person is going to be livid with themselves, and they're not going to be able to get out of their own head because it's all about being better than the people around them for the ego-oriented person. Also, goal setting is a really interesting tactic. If an ego-oriented person sets goals, then all of a sudden their idea of success is no longer being better than those around them, but rather accomplishing more goals than those around them. And that, in the end, turns into a task orientation because they're trying to complete as many goals and make themselves much better on a goal level than everyone else around them. So that's an easy trick. Finally, there's the target. Target is another theory that'll help people become more task-oriented. A big part of making sure athletes are task-oriented is the design of the task. If you make an athlete compete with him or herself, then all of a sudden they have to be task-oriented as opposed to competing with the others around them. Authority is another huge way to get not only buy-in, but to help people compete at the highest level. If you get captains and seniors involved, then the ego-oriented person who knows that, hey, I'm never really going to be better than the senior, but this senior wants me to do this to get better, they might go for it. Recognition is a huge one. This kind of goes along with rewards. Young athletes especially are motivated by recognition from their peers. So when you give out rewards as a coach, make some aspect of recognition. Gentry and Catanzaro talk about buying shirts for the weight room so that when they achieve a certain weight goal, they wear that shirt. The reason why this is so good is because one, a shirt really isn't that expensive, but two, when they're wearing that shirt, their teammates, everyone in the athletic department, right? Maybe even some kids around campus who aren't even associated with athletics know the achievement that they got, and they in some way have to recognize it because that athlete is wearing that shirt. Another idea is grouping. If you switch up groups, then the ego-oriented person is always going to be bettering themselves from the people in the group, as opposed to just a group that maybe an ego-oriented person dominates. If they're in that situation, then they're not going to really be pushed. If you change the groups, you change the competition, they have to constantly get better. Evaluation. When you're evaluating an athlete, focus on them. Don't focus on the others around them. Again, going back to that ego and task orientation. And finally, time. Create a due date. Everyone knows that when professors say, oh, yeah, just work on it, it never gets done. But when they say, well, it's due tomorrow, well, you kind of have to do it by tomorrow. Otherwise, it's not going to get done and you suffer for it. So I use the cliche here, variety is the spice of life. And that's because we're trying to avoid burnout. And variety is the best way to do that. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that. So I have a couple up here. One is the quotes that your teams live by, the adages or your mottos, right? Change them up. Don't always stay with the same ones. Another one is signage. Weight rooms usually have plenty of signage, but it's always the same. Even just having numerous signs that you cycle through in a year can be a great change of scenery that may push your athletes to be in the weight room and push a little bit harder. Another one is monthly themes. When people, oftentimes coaches have a theme for a year, but if you shorten that up and you make it per month or per week or for every 2 weeks, it doesn't really exactly matter how long you do it, as long as people don't get tired of it. It helps to keep people motivated. You can have themes based off of excellence, based off of effort. There's a whole myriad of opportunities there. And then finally, alternate lifts. No one likes going into the weight room and doing the exact same workout every day. I even kind of thought up an idea of a build your own type of workout. I guess a coach could go so far as to make a list of alternate lifts and tell their kids that, okay, when you go into the weight room, you have to pick 2 from each category, and once you pick them, you have to cross them off. This would be the top amount of variety that you could possibly work into it. I don't necessarily advocate this because you have people who may just not cross off the ones or do only what they like, but it is maybe an idea for a lift once a week, once a month, every 2 weeks to keep variety. Another great theory for motivation is self-determination theory. And this basically works off the idea that when athletes feel that they're confident or competent in their sport or skill, and they feel like people relate to them, and they feel that they are allowed to find creative solutions to the problems that they face, they end up with a motivation. They make it their own, and they're willing to work for it. So again, the idea is, if I'm constantly telling an athlete that his or her performance is subpar and it will only ever be subpar, that's a problem. They'll start to believe it. The opposite is also true. Relatedness, this really comes into emotional intelligence. And App State has a really great adage here. They talk about, one of the things the coaches say is, nobody cares what you know until you know that you care. And that's something that in my program I would live by. You have to make sure that your kids know that you're there for them. In autonomy, another big thing that destroys autonomy is pressure to win. Now, I don't want to say that that athletic departments shouldn't put an emphasis on winning. There should be. But if you feel like you have to win, eventually, when you're in a situation where you don't think you will, you end up unmotivated. When the Citadel played Alabama and they got whooped, I highly doubt that the coach of the Citadel walked into that locker room after the game and started yelling at them for a bad game. Chances are he walked in and said, you know, we played hard, but we got beat. No one expected us to win, and that's okay. I only care that you played hard. All of a sudden, if he walks in and says something like that, his kids are ready to play for him for the next game. But if he yells at them for losing to Alabama, the kids are gonna sit there and say, well, what do you want from me, coach? They're just better than we are. So make sure you keep that in mind as a coach and as a strength and conditioning coach. Finally, the one last big idea for motivation that I'm going to talk about is thermostats versus thermometers. And this is exclusively something that I've heard from App State. They talk about how thermometers take a reading, right? They adjust the room temperature and they give a reading of that temperature and they spit out the same thing as what that temperature is. Whereas thermostats actively adjust the temperature of the room. They are an initiator of change and they make something either better or hotter or colder. The whole idea is that if you're a thermostat, you can change the environment of a weight room. And when you walk in at 6 a.m. and everyone's tired, if you're a thermostat, you can raise the level. Whereas if you're a thermometer, you're going to be tired, you're going to be dragging, and the weight session's going to be horrible. So I'm going to move into the SWOT analysis here really quickly. I want to talk about the type of organizational structure that I did a SWOT analysis on. And this organizational structure is set up kind of where every sport is a different division of athletics, as well as things like every different support group, such as strength and conditioning and athletic training. And so then below that, every strength and conditioning coach would be assigned to an athletic team in the same way that athletic trainers are assigned to the athletic teams here at Leeds McRae. And then the coaches would be in each of the divisions. So really quickly, I'm going to go over the strengths and weaknesses here. Again, keep in mind the structure that I just mentioned. In this type of structure, one of the strengths is that strength and conditioning coaches are not directly under the coaches of each sport, and so they have the autonomy to adapt. I talked about autonomy earlier. Having the ability to find creative solutions to the problems presented is a really great way to produce a better product, as well as to get motivation. Communication is also streamlined. So I mentioned how every strength and conditioning coach is going to be matched up with a team. That means that a coach only has to talk to one strength and conditioning coach, as opposed to the head coach of the division talking to the head strength and conditioning coach, who's going to relay that information all the way down. It's a much more streamlined position. This is also a double-edged sword, as you'll see later on. It's also a very collaborative environment. Because you have people between divisions working together, that your divisions of the organization have to work together. Weaknesses: since the strength and conditioning coach is not actually part of the sport team, you end up with a situation in which the other coaches may not recognize the strength and conditioning coach as a true coach. And that can be a problem and can kind of lead to a clique environment. The communication is still not optimized. Since you're in a different division, your desks aren't right next to each other. You're not privy to the conversations that coaches and assistant coaches have by looking over their shoulder, seeing their assistant coach, and having a conversation. So there is some room for improvement in communication. However, you do have a pretty good situation for communication. Finally, opinions may differ. Again, this autonomy is a double-edged sword, just like the communication is, because coaches may want their players to do X, Y, and Z, whereas strength and conditioning coaches, who have a completely different perspective, want their players to be the best athletes possible. So this kind of leads to the collaborative environment that must be grown between the strength and conditioning coaches and the sport coaches. Finally, I have just a couple opportunities and threats. So one of the biggest opportunities of a division system, like I just described, is that funding is very secure. The strength and conditioning coaches are always going to get some portion of the athletic budget to do their job. Whereas if the strength and conditioning coaches are under each one of the different coaches, a coach may not be a fan of strength and conditioning, and so the funding goes away. Additionally, you may have a situation in which, like, say football has a ton of money and they are very willing to increase the strength and conditioning program, so they put a whole lot of weights in the weight room. And say, for instance, basketball, the coach of basketball doesn't really like that philosophy as much, and so they don't. You may end up with conflicts between basketball and football because football built the weight room and basketball didn't. Also, the big benefit for strength and conditioning coach is that is mandated by the administration. Because the division is completely separate from the rest of the other sports, the upper levels of management in athletics are always going to stand behind strength and conditioning. Finally, threats. In this scenario, you have a risk of marginalization. You have one person at the top of athletics who determines how important strength and conditioning is going to be for the entire group of athletics as a whole. So if you don't get the buy-in from that one person at the top, well, you're kind of out of luck. Finally, you do have a possibility of overwork. If there's not enough strength and conditioning coaches to go around, say you only hire one or two and you have a whole ton of sports, you're going to end up with a scenario in which your strength and conditioning coaches get burnt out because they're assigned to way too many sports. This wouldn't ever happen if you had a position underneath the underneath each sport in a different organizational structure. So in the end, the science is settled, and the motivation, the organizational structure is what counts. This is where strength and conditioning programs either stand or fail. The best strength and conditioning programs are good at motivating and make their organizational structure work. I'd like to end with my personal mission statement. That is that my dream is to turn others into the best everyday athlete that they can possibly be by teaching them how fitness is critical to fulfilling life. I'm a fitness junkie. I love fitness. I love to see people get fit. I love to see people be the best people they can be. And I believe that's through athleticism. And you don't necessarily have to be an athlete to want to be athletic. Even being somebody who sits at a desk all day, that is a long-term task, that is a repetitive task. In a sense, you're still an athlete, and I want you to have the athleticism that is necessary to be able to do and perform that task to the best of your ability. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy.